July 1944. While the world was burning in the trenches of Normandy, 700 men in suits gathered at a luxury hotel in New Hampshire. They weren't there to fight a war. They were there to decide who would own the peace. History books tell you this was a meeting of cooperation, a moment where 44 nations came together to stabilize the global economy. But if you read the actual minutes, you won't find cooperation. You'll find a hostage negotiation. 2 men, 2 visions, 1 winner. The system governing your wallet today isn't the result of economic science. It is the result of a political ambush that happened 80 years ago. And the weapon they used wasn't a gun. It was gold. In the world of sound money, there is a recurring dream. It is the dream of the classical gold standard. We look back at the late 19th century and see a paradise of stability. A time when money was honest, when governments couldn't print away your savings, and when inflation was mathematically impossible. But nostalgia is a poor historian. If you strip away the romance and look at the raw data from 1879 to 1913, that paradise disappears. The reality of the gold standard wasn't stability. It was violent volatility. During those golden years, wholesale prices in the United States didn't just stay flat. They swung wildly. In fact, price fluctuation was actually higher under gold than it has been in the fiat era that followed. And the human cost was paid in silence. The average unemployment rate in America during the gold era was 6.8%. In the post-war fiat era, it dropped to 5%. We traded the ability to redeem paper for metal, for the ability to keep a job. We like to imagine that gold imposed discipline on the market, but it didn't impose discipline. It imposed randomness. If a prospector in California struck a vein, prices rose. If a mine in South Africa flooded, prices collapsed. Prices collapsed. The entire global economy, the price of bread in London, the cost of steel in Pittsburgh, was not determined by productivity. It was determined by how much yellow metal could be clawed out of the earth in a given year. It was a system that handed the keys of the economy to geology. So if the gold standard was so flawed, so volatile, and so indifferent to human suffering, why did the entire world adopt it? The answer isn't economic wisdom. The answer is that we didn't choose it at all. It was an accident. 1717, the Royal Mint, London. The master of the mint is a man you might know, Sir Isaac Newton. We remember him for the falling apple and the laws of gravity, but his most lasting impact wasn't on physics. It was on your wallet. Newton was tasked with setting the exchange rate between gold and silver, and the smartest man in history got the math wrong. He set the price of silver too low relative to gold. In the ruthless logic of the market, silver did what undervalued assets always do. It vanished from circulation. Britain didn't choose the gold standard. Britain fell into it because they simply ran out of silver coins. It was a bureaucratic glitch. But here's where the accident became an empire. Because Britain was the dominant superpower of the age, the rest of the world didn't see a mistake. They saw a standard. Germany, Japan, and eventually the United States all scrambled to peg their currencies to gold. Not because it was scientifically superior, but because they needed to trade with London. The entire foundation of 19th century finance, the system libertarians still revere as the pinnacle of sound money, was based on a rounding error by a physicist. We built a global temple on a cracked foundation. But once that error became law, it didn't just sit there. It began to tighten its grip around the throat of the global economy. The central flaw of this system wasn't political, it was mathematical. An economy is capable of infinite expansion. Gold is not. When human productivity outpaced the speed of mining, the system ran into a wall. Money became scarce, and when money is scarce, prices collapse. Economists call this deflation. To a consumer today, falling prices sound like a gift. But to a debtor in the 19th century, deflation was a death sentence. Consider the American farmer in 1890. He borrows $100 to plant his crop. At the time, wheat trades at $1 a bushel. His debt equals 100 bushels. But then, the gold supply tightens. Prices fall. Wheat drops to 50 cents. The number on his loan paper hasn't changed. But the reality has. To pay back that same $100, he now has to harvest 200 bushels. The bank didn't change the terms. The gold standard changed the value of his sweat. This is the mechanism that transfers wealth from the man who works to the man who waits. It is why William Jennings Bryan famously screamed that mankind was being crucified on a cross of gold. He wasn't being poetic, he was doing the math. We had built a global engine where prosperity didn't depend on innovation or labor. It depended on geology. If you were a creditor, it was a paradise. If you were a debtor, it was a trap. And that pressure kept building, tighter and tighter, until 1914, when the first gunshot of the Great War blew the entire structure apart, 1919 to 1939. The 30 years between the Great Wars were not just a time of geopolitical tension, they were a bloodbath for global finance. With the gold standard shattered, the world entered a state of nature where every nation became a predator. They called it beggar thy neighbor. Governments realized they could steal export markets simply by driving their own currency into the dirt. It was a race to the bottom that no one could win. In Germany, the Weimar Republic printed money until a loaf of bread cost billions of marks, a hyperinflation that burned away the life savings of an entire generation in months. By 1929, the Great Depression turned this financial friction into a total global seizure. Trade didn't just slow down, it evaporated. As the middle class was hollowed out by economic collapse, they reached for the only thing left: radicalism. Fascism didn't rise from political debates, it grew out of the ash of hyperinflation and the despair of empty bank accounts. The elites of the era watched this chaos and learned a brutal lesson. They realized that if currency markets are left completely free and unregulated, the system will eventually commit suicide. They decided that the world could no longer survive on accidents like Isaac Newton's math or the randomness of gold mines. They needed a manager. They needed a global government for central banks. And that collective fear is exactly what brought 44 nations to the hotel in New Hampshire. But they didn't come to Bretton Woods to cooperate. They came to conquer. 44 nations were invited to Bretton Woods, but the world was really watching a duel between two men. In one corner was John Maynard Keynes, the intellectual titan representing a bankrupt British Empire. In the other was Harry Dexter White, a ruthless bureaucrat from the US Treasury, representing the world's new creditor-in-chief. Keynes arrived with a radical vision for fairness. He proposed a global currency called the Bancor, a neutral unit of account that belonged to no single nation. His system was designed to be symmetrical, punishing not just the nations in debt, but also the nations with massive trade surpluses. He wanted to stop the winners from strangling the losers. Harry Dexter White looked at this plan and saw a threat to American dominance. Why should the United States, the nation holding the majority of the world's gold, be penalized for its success? White's counterproposal was sharp and self-serving. No Bancor, no symmetry. Instead, the system would revolve around the US $2-year dollar, the only currency fixed to gold. Every other nation would be forced to peg their money to the dollar, and the pressure to adjust would fall solely on the shoulders of the debtors. It was a brilliant architecture of capture. Despite the intellectual weight of Keynes, the British had already lost before they arrived. As Lord Halifax famously whispered, "They have the money bags, but we have the brains." In the end, brains don't write the rules of global finance. Money bags do. The IMF was born not to save the world from chaos, but to ensure that the chaos was managed on American terms, using American debt. It was a conquest disguised as a conference. But the problem with building a kingdom on a single currency is that the king must eventually break his own promises. By the late 1960s, the king began to bleed. The United States had made a promise at Bretton Woods. Any nation could bring $35 to the window and leave with an ounce of gold. But Washington was fighting a massive war in Vietnam and funding an ambitious social agenda at home. To pay for it, they did what every empire eventually does. They printed more money than they had metal. The world noticed. Nations like France began sending ships filled with paper dollars back to New York, demanding their gold. The vaults were emptying. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon walked onto national television and ended the era of honest accounting. He temporarily suspended the convertibility of the dollar into gold. It was the largest unilateral default in human history, but it was presented as a technical adjustment for stability. The anchor was gone. The dollar was now backed by nothing but the full faith and credit of a government that had just broken its word. In the years that followed, the system didn't return to gold. It drifted into the era of floating exchange rates. Money became a commodity, volatile and untethered, traded on screens based on supply and demand. This shattered the original mission of the IMF. They were no longer there to manage a fixed standard because the standard no longer existed. Instead, they transformed. They became a global fire department for a world now built on flammable debt. And this new fire department had a very specific way of putting out the flames. Today we are told the IMF is a global safety net, a lender of last resort designed to prevent the total collapse of the world economy. But if you look at the mechanics of the last 50 years, a different picture emerges. In the world of modern finance, a crisis is not a bug, it is a feature. The engine works in a repeating cycle. First, the world is flooded with cheap dollar-denominated debt. Developing nations and corporations borrow heavily to fund growth, believing the party will never end. Then the winds shift, the dollar appreciates, interest rates rise. Suddenly, those cheap loans become impossible to service. This is the moment the trap snaps shut. When a nation is on the verge of default, the IMF arrives. We call it a bailout, but the word is a polite fiction. The IMF doesn't just hand over a check. It provides new loans to pay off the old ones, usually with strict conditions known as structural adjustments. To save the currency, the nation must cut social spending, privatize its assets, and lower the standard of living for its citizens. It is a forensic extraction. The dry irony of a bailout is that the money rarely stays in the country it's meant to save. It flows through the local government and directly back into the ledgers of the international banks that made the bad loans in the first place. The taxpayer bears the risk, while the creditor is made whole. This is the world Harry Dexter White built at Bretton Woods, but with one terrifying difference. In 1944, the system had a mechanical brake called gold. Since 1971, that brake has been removed. You are now living inside a high-speed race car that has been stripped of its stopping power. We are hurtling forward on a track made of pure credit, governed by a set of rules written 80 years ago for a world that no longer exists. So where does this leave us? We tend to think of the economy like the weather, something that just happens. But history shows us it is engineered. The gold standard was an accident. The interwar period was a brawl. Bretton Woods was a capture. And the system we have now? It's a temporary truce. Since 1971, we have been running a massive experiment. A global economy backed by nothing but faith in government debt. History teaches us one absolute rule. No monetary system lasts forever. The average lifespan of these orders is about 30 to 40 years. We are now in year 50 plus of the floating dollar. The question isn't if the next Bretton Woods will happen. The question is when the chairs are rearranged at the next big table, who will be sitting there? And will you be prepared for the rules they write? They make. This is financial money history. If you want to understand the next chapter before it's written, leave a 1 in the comments. Subscribe, and keep watching the hands, not the mouth.